Even 30 years later, I still hear the guns of Tannenberg in my sleep. That night the forests of East Prussia trembled with artillery, and we knew war had begun. We marched all night through damp forest roads. No one spoke much, only the sound of boots in mud and rumors that a massive Russian army was moving toward us. When dawn came we saw the wide fields of East Prussia. Fog clung to the ground, and somewhere ahead of us the Russian army waited silently. News spread quickly through the ranks. 2 massive Russian armies were entering East Prussia. Their numbers were so large many believed Germany might be crushed. Then new generals arrived. They said our plan was not retreat but encirclement. At that moment none of us truly understood what that meant. We dug trenches along the forest edge, waiting for the Russians to walk into the enormous trap our generals were quietly preparing. The next day the artillery began. The ground shook beneath our boots, and the grey sky tore open with towering columns of black smoke. Through the drifting smoke we finally saw them, thousands of Russian soldiers moving across the fields like a dark human tide. For the first time I truly felt fear. There were too many, but our orders were clear: hold the line and wait. We did not yet know the trap was closing around the Russian army, but somehow we could feel history moving toward us. Our artillery finally answered. The entire field trembled with thunder, and I watched the first Russian soldiers collapse in the distance. Rifle fire erupted across the entire line. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, and suddenly the war felt closer than ever before. But the Russians kept advancing. They walked through smoke and craters as if the entire battlefield was slowly swallowing them. We fired until our rifle barrels burned hot, yet they kept coming forward step by step through smoke and fallen men. An artillery shell exploded right behind us. Dirt and debris flew everywhere, and for several seconds I could hear nothing. When my hearing returned, the friend beside me was gone. Only his helmet remained half buried in the mud. But war never waits for grief. The rifles began firing again, and we had no choice but to continue fighting. By afternoon the field was covered with bodies. Yet the Russian army still advanced like a relentless tide across the shattered land. What we did not know was that German armies to the north and south were already moving to close the trap. Night fell and the battlefield became strangely quiet. But deep inside we knew the real battle was only beginning. That night we barely slept. Cold wind moved through the pine forest, and everyone knew the battle would grow far more violent when morning arrived. Before sunrise the officers woke us. They said the Russian army had pushed even deeper into East Prussia. We heard the Russian army was splitting into several marching columns. That meant they were starting to lose contact with each other. Those reports made our officers smile for the first time in days. At that moment we did not understand, but the great trap was slowly closing around the Russian army. By noon our artillery began firing from 2 different directions. The Russian soldiers began realizing something was wrong. Their marching columns slowed among the smoke and explosions. Then we received orders to advance. For the first time in the battle we climbed out of our trenches. We advanced across fields filled with smoke and craters, unsure what waited ahead. Only later did we realize the truth. We were not just fighting. We were closing the encirclement. As we advanced through the smoke, I began noticing small groups of Russian soldiers slowly retreating across the battlefield. Our officers ordered us forward faster. They knew the Russian army was beginning to panic. Artillery continued exploding behind them. The Russian soldiers were now trapped between walls of fire. That was when I understood we were closing the encirclement. The Russians were surrounded by forests and our artillery lines. Russian troops started abandoning artillery and wagons as they tried desperately to escape the encirclement. We began capturing prisoners. Dozens of Russian soldiers raised their hands and surrendered before our rifles. Some Russian soldiers continued fighting desperately as the encirclement tightened around them. Shells exploded everywhere as both sides fought for every meter of ground. But the encirclement tightened further. The Russian army had no escape left. We knew the battle was slowly reaching its final moments. Russian formations began collapsing. Scattered gunfire echoed across the field as small groups tried to fight on in desperation. Some Russian soldiers dropped their rifles. They raised their hands as we approached through the drifting smoke. Long lines of prisoners began forming. We escorted them away from the battlefield filled with smoke and fallen soldiers. The field was now filled with abandoned artillery, broken wagons, and scattered backpacks. After days of fighting, the sudden silence felt strange to all of us. Smoke still drifted above empty trenches across the battlefield. Some of us returned to search for wounded comrades among the craters. Our officers began realizing the Russian army had been completely destroyed. Tens of thousands of Russian prisoners were marched away along muddy roads. 30 years later I still remember that field, the smoke, the silence, and the feeling that history had changed before our eyes. That night the gunfire echoed through the forest. There was no clear front line anymore. Only shadows running between pine trees and lost voices calling in darkness. We began to understand what was happening. The Russians were no longer advancing. They were trapped. And our lines were slowly closing around them. Rumors spread quickly through the ranks. Men whispered that the Russian army was almost completely surrounded. Yet none of us dared to believe it. That morning our artillery began firing relentlessly. The ground trembled beneath us. We all knew it could only mean one thing. The artillery roared for hours. Smoke swallowed the sky. No one spoke. Yet all of us sensed the battle was entering its final act. When the order came to advance, we climbed out of the trench. No cheering followed. Only heavy footsteps and gunfire waiting ahead. We advanced across empty fields. Ahead of us Russian soldiers were desperately trying to break the encirclement. Gun smoke covered the entire sky. I saw groups of Russian soldiers running in every direction. Their formations were gone. They were simply desperate men searching for a way to survive. By noon the gunfire began to fade. The fields were filled with wounded men and prisoners. We knew the battle was nearly over. That afternoon we stood in silence across the battlefield. The encirclement was complete. The Russian army had been utterly defeated at Tannenberg. After the battle we walked across fields still covered in smoke. The guns were silent now. leaving only wind and the exhausted faces of men who survived. We saw long columns of Russian prisoners being marched away. They walked slowly with heads lowered. No army remained anymore. Only exhausted human beings. There were so many prisoners that we barely knew where to send them. The small roads of East Prussia were crowded with endless marching columns. I remember staring toward distant forests. Only days earlier those woods had been filled with gunfire and artillery. We slowly realized we had witnessed something far greater than any battle most of us had ever seen before. Officers said an entire Russian army had been destroyed. We listened quietly, still struggling to believe such a thing. A friend of mine said the war would surely end soon after such a victory. None of us knew how terribly wrong he was. We buried the dead right there on the field. Friend and enemy lay side by side beneath the cold earth. That evening East Prussia felt strangely quiet. After days of chaos, the silence itself made us uneasy. We did not yet know that Tannenberg would become one of Germany's greatest victories of the entire war. Many years later I still remember the smell of gunpowder across those fields. Tannenberg was not just a victory. It was a memory that never left us. I remember the faces of the men who never returned. In my memory they still stand there among the pine forests and drifting gun smoke. Back then war felt like a storm. It arrived suddenly and violently, carrying away the youth we barely had time to understand. When we were young we believed victory meant everything. But growing older I learned war mostly leaves behind empty spaces. Young people today read about Tannenberg in books. For us it was sound, smoke, fear, and the pounding of our own hearts. Sometimes at night I still hear the artillery in my dreams. The sounds of 1914 have never completely left me. Time passed. Yet the battlefield memories remain as clear to me as if they happened yesterday. Tannenberg changed history. But for me it will always remain the place where we lost too many friends. If there is one thing I learned from that battle, it is that war is never like the stories people tell. And whenever I think about Tannenberg, victory is not the first thing I remember. I remember the men who stood beside me that day. Sometimes I return to those fields in my memory. Everything seems untouched, as if the battle never truly left that land. In my memory the young soldiers still march across the field, rifles on their shoulders, unaware of the fate waiting ahead. I often wonder how many of them survived like I did. The answer is probably far fewer than we once hoped. Time has changed the world. Yet the memory of war remains there, silent and never completely gone. Whenever I tell this story I do not try to speak about victory. I only try to remember the men who stood beside me. Those friends remain forever young in my memory, standing beneath the grey sky and gun smoke of 1914. War took away too much. Yet it also taught us the value of every moment we were still alive. Whenever I remember Tannenberg, I always return to that misty morning when everything began. Every battle eventually ends. But the memories carried by those who survive never truly disappear. And when I close my eyes, I still see that field where we once stood together beneath the sky of 1914. Many decades have passed since that day. The world has changed. Yet the memory of that battle has remained with me all my life. The young soldiers I once knew now exist only in fading photographs and in the memories I carry. Sometimes I wonder if they remember us too. The ones who survived long enough to tell the story. Great battles are written in history books. But ordinary soldiers are the ones who carry the real memories. For the world, Tannenberg was a great victory. For me it was the place where our youth came to an end. If there is one thing I wish future generations to understand, it is that war is never as glorious as people imagine. Those who fell cannot tell their stories. That is why survivors like us must remember for them. When I stand before those graves, I always hear the old gunfire and see the young faces again. Tannenberg entered history. But to me it will always be the story of ordinary men living through an extraordinary and terrible time. And whenever I remember Tannenberg, I do not think about victory. I remember the men who stood beside me beneath the sky of 1914.